Welcome to Borders and Belonging, a podcast that explores issues in global migration and aims to debunk myths about migration based on current research. This series is produced by CERC Migration and Democracy. I'm Maggie Perzyna, a researcher with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration Program at Toronto Metropolitan University. Today, we're going to explore the thorny problems of human smuggling and human trafficking, two issues that commonly get conflated. We'll discuss what these terms mean and how they differ. In this episode, two leading experts will help us understand why migrants are smuggled, how gender and race come into the mix, and shed light on how certain policies may actually put migrants at more risk. But first, we'll speak to someone who has seen firsthand the effects of anti-trafficking policies on migrants in Europe. Luca Stevenson is a sex worker and activist based in Belgium. He is also the operations officer at the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance. In 2017, Luca was living in Scotland. One day, he was scrolling through the news when he came across something that stopped him in his tracks.
And there was this really shocking article, like the Scottish police, the Scotland police forces, they made this press release announcing that they had stopped hundreds of women coming from Central Europe, from Romania, moving to Scotland because they were potentially victims of trafficking.
Luca read the article carefully. From what he could glean, the police didn't actually have any evidence of trafficking. And at the time, Scotland was still part of the European Union. It meant that people from Romania could live and work freely in Scotland. So what exactly was going on?
The police of Scotland basically used this very vague definition of trafficking as a way to stop migrant women from entering the countries. I thought it was interesting that they would actually be public about it because it's actually completely against the human rights of EU citizens, but they were actually boasting it as a form of prevention of trafficking. So if this woman were single, they were coming in the UK, or they were with a man, they were not speaking English very well, they didn't have a job arrival in the country, therefore they were potential victims of trafficking and they were not allowed in the country.
To Luca, this was a prime example of how authorities tend to assume that many migrant women, including sex workers, are being trafficked. He says it's an assumption that can put vulnerable people in even more precarious situations, especially when they're escaping conflict.
There's been quite a lot of article and media around how Ukrainian women were being trafficked in order to work in the sex industry in Europe. And this is also, again, not the reality. Is that it's true that there are many Ukrainian women who are crossing the border, and some of them will work in the sex industry. Like other workers who have limited access to the labor market, they will choose sex work in order to make a living. And our organization on the ground are providing health services, legal support, administrative support to these women, not just women, but mainly women, who are going to work in the sex industry. But this has been manipulated by different organizations and the media to say that there was this huge wave of trafficking in human beings at the border, which is simply not the reality.
To be clear, Luca is aware that human trafficking is an issue that exists and must be addressed. But he worries that doing so without including migrants and sex workers in the conversation may further marginalize and endanger them.
Globally, sex workers are usually at high risk of human rights violation and violence. In particular, when it comes to violence, sex workers are usually an easy target for people who would try to take advantage of them, either through physical violence or robbery, sexual violence, rape, etc. And the main reason is that very few sex workers would report a crime committed against them to the police or to the authorities. And this is even more the case when people are migrant sex workers and in particular undocumented migrants. So we know that in Europe, the majority of people who sell sex are migrants, a large number of them undocumented migrants.
And it's not just undocumented migrants that are at risk of persecution under anti-trafficking laws. Luca notes that those trying to help them might be at risk too.
Even organizations like human rights organizations who are providing support to these migrants can be now targeted as trafficking or profiting from trafficking.
To Luca, this fear-mongering around trafficking is actually a symptom of something much more systemic: racism.
Lots of the laws that have been developed to prevent trafficking are actually laws that are aimed at preventing migration. And if you look at the history of anti-trafficking legislation in the US, like Mann Act, for example, or in Europe, despite the way that they are being published or advertised as a way of preventing exploitation of sexual exploitation, etc. The reality that these laws are just aimed at preventing migration and migration of women in particular from the global south. So for us, definitely these laws are racist.
Luca Stevenson and his colleagues at the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance are campaigning for the decriminalization of sex work in Europe and hope that such policy changes will lead to better protections for migrant sex workers. Our thanks to Luca for bringing his perspective from the field. Joining me today to talk about the interwoven narratives around human smuggling and human trafficking is Professor Kamala Kempadoo from York University. She's an author and specialist in gender, feminist and women's studies, political science, and development studies. And Gabriella Sanchez, an ethnographer and director of field research at the School of Criminology and Social Justice, University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Her work centers on the experience and perspectives of migrants from around the world. Human smuggling and human trafficking are often conflated to mean the same thing. Can you explain the difference? Gabriella, let's start with you.
Migrant smuggling is the facilitation of the entry of a person into a country other than their own. And this is typically, in exchange for a fee or some sort of material benefit as the protocol outlines it. While human trafficking assumes the existence of coercion and intimidation and also the extraction of and profit, of the labor of another person. Most typically, this has been looked at from the conflation as well of sex work and as trafficking, which is another one of the layers that complicate the definition.
Professor Kempadoo, any additional thoughts?
I think one of the main differences that I understand of these two ideas is that often around human trafficking, people assume that the person moving across the border or into some kind of work is a victim and is forced. Whereas in smuggling, there's often a sense of agency of the person moving. And I think that's an important difference between the two.
Why do migrants resort to being smuggled across borders? What are the root causes here?
People turn to smuggling facilitators because there is not equal access to the documentation or to, visas or passports that would allow them to travel in a dignified manner. And many times we have to keep in mind that access to documents like birth certificates, identification cards, let alone passports and visas themselves, require a lot of paperwork and also demand a certain knowledge on how to navigate the system to obtain them. Most people do, in fact, aim to travel in a legal and safe manner. The very inequality that is embedded within the processes that are connected to obtaining all of this documentation prevents them from traveling that way.
I completely agree with that. And that is also, what happens around the idea of human trafficking, except for that we also have the situation that people are also looking for employment work when they get somewhere else. And the kind of areas that people are going into are often then underground or in the informal sector. So they remain in sort of criminalized work or sectors.
So is human smuggling a recent phenomenon historically, or is this something that's been going on for a long time?
I think it's been exacerbated recently by border controls and immigration and the increasing difficulty to move between countries, between areas of the world. It's been going on for a long time. I mean, human migration is it characterizes our existence. But smuggling and trafficking can only exist if you have borders between nations.
There's smugglers, and here I am going to be talking about the specific case of the U.S.-Mexico border. Smugglers appear in the literature in the 1800s, and they are very much related to the emergence of the creation of what was the U.S.-Mexico border in itself. So it is, very, very much connected to the notion of borders, to the enforcement of borders, and of course to the emergence of the protocol, in the year 2000. Before then, it was even that conflation of human trafficking and migrant smuggling was even stronger, and the two of them were pretty much assumed to be, the same. But it is definitely connected to border enforcement and control that we have, that there's increased interest on how they take place has emerged.
Can I just ask you to elaborate a little bit on the protocol?
When I talk about the protocol, I'm referring to the protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air. And this was a tool that was developed by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in coordination with other countries. And this was aimed at typifying what smuggling and also trafficking and its corresponding protocol was all about. So these legal tools gave us the first definitions, and the ones in which we have been operating pretty much for the last 22 years.
Professor Kempadoo, you've written about campaigns about human trafficking, comparing the modern anti-slavery movement, abolitionist feminism, and celebrity humanitarianism. What connects these campaigns, and who does the narrative serve when everything is grouped under human trafficking?
It's a big question, but yes, we have many campaigns around the world at this time connecting feminists, connecting churches, connecting governments that are aimed at abolishing slavery and modern-day slavery, as it's called, and human trafficking. Unfortunately, I think the idea of human trafficking has become so broad that almost anything falls under it. So, femicide in Latin America, for example, can be classified as human trafficking. Sex tourism, domestic work, a lot of things become labeled as human trafficking. And there's a lot of blurriness between what people consider to be forced labor or modern slavery and coercion across borders, smuggling. As I said earlier, one of the common themes across these different campaigns is the idea that people are being victimized, that they are, that they had no choice in the movement or the kind of work that they're doing, and need to be rescued and saved. And so consequently have a sort of savior politics that's happening around the world. It's primarily, the wealthier countries and the elites who are going around trying to rescue people from what they see to be dire circumstances.
The media and pop culture are full of stories of migrants being forced into indentured labor, the sex trade, or paying exorbitant fees to cross borders. Human smugglers are often portrayed as evil or primarily linked to organized crime. Based on your research, is this a true representation of those involved in smuggling?
I think that, first of all, it is very important to notice how most of these representations are embedded into even larger notions of gender and race. The notion of the smuggler, the very fact that the moment we say the word smuggler, we think of a male, of a man rather than a woman. In that we also envision or think of them as men of color. It's already sending us a very clear framework, in terms of how smuggling is thought of or was conceptualized from the very beginning. It was a crime that was committed by the people, from the global south. Once we start thinking, about that, we can start, also unpacking other elements of smuggling. The data, the evidence on the ground shows us that smuggling is a crime of the poor and for the poor. Most of the people who participate in it live along the migration pathway, and they are capitalizing on their knowledge of primarily the landscape, the geography. And they are also facilitating some of these connections based on their social networks, on their acquaintances. Hardly anyone that participates in migrant smuggling has connections to what we traditionally think of as transnationally organized crime, as gangs, as mafias. Those are tools that have been very effective at facilitating the criminalization of migrants in general, and by extension of the processes that they rely on to migrate irregularly. Many of these ideas, many of these images, only fuel all of the industry that is behind counter-smuggling and migration control, and it is really not reflective of how migrant smuggling is organized on the ground.
Dr. Kempadoo, anything to add?
The other thing I think we tend to overlook, or is overlooked in the media and the pop culture, and is that a lot of what takes place under smuggling or so-called human trafficking is desired by the person moving, right? They want to move from A to B and will seek out or, agree to be indebted to a person who's aiding them and helping them across a border or helping them to get a job, and agree to a certain level of debt, right, in order to get past these borders that are not allowing them in, or, being able to get a job. So that part of the equation is something that is really not shown in media and the sort of, general culture and discussions. It's as if people are being dragged and, kidnapped or forced against their will by, a set of evil men, whether these are smugglers or, but trafficking particularly carries this kind of image. Smuggling perhaps is less so, but definitely with the trafficking, that, the agency of people and their desire to actually get, improve their life, to move into another country, to find a better job and living conditions is usually overlooked in these narratives about human trafficking particularly.
So who exactly are the people who are helping smuggle migrants across the border?
Most of the facilitation processes, are carried out, again, by people who live along the migration pathway. So these are people from villages, people who live along the borders, people who know the roads that migrants travel through. And they can be both male and female. Women many times do perform roles that are very gendered in nature. For example, they provide room and board. They take care of migrants who have been injured, help nurse children, watch over pregnant women or elderly migrants who might have fallen behind in terms of their transits. And something that we are documenting more clearly throughout the Americas and the Caribbean is actually the participation of young people. These are children who also are very knowledgeable, because these are the places where they usually play, where they grow up, in terms of how the border works, who is there, who are the main actors. And many of them may also be collaborating in an effort to pay for their own journeys. So they pay off a spot in one of those boats and the trucks, any other kind of means of transportation that is used for them to arrive somewhere. Another element that I think many times we forget is, once again, this dimension of gender, how we see a very clear presence of women, as I said before, doing what would be more gender tasks, but also facilitating recruitment, many times collecting the fees, and doing a lot of coordinating work when it comes to putting people in touch, not only with other smugglers, but also once they reach their destination. Women, because most of them stay within their own communities, tend to have a very good knowledge of doctors, schools, stores, places where you can get medication or medical attention for free, that kind of thing. So there's all of these dimensions that many times we don't think about, or that typically are forgotten in the discourse on smuggling.
I'll add something there, because some of the research and what we're seeing around particularly the sex trade is that it's often women who are helping to facilitate the movement and migration and employment, right, of other women. And it's been very pronounced from West Africa into Europe, for example, into sex work. And, it's sort of relying on a network of women who have worked before there, women who may be in, say, Italy, and recruit other women to come to move to Italy, for example. So this is also, specifically for the sex trade. And then there are other people involved, maybe people in the entertainment industry who are, facilitating and helping women to get from A to B and find a job. So, it's in the sex trade, there's that complication as well.
So I know we've touched on this in the previous questions, but how does looking at gender and race add to our understanding of human smuggling?
Gabriella's already touched on this very nicely in pointing out how there's this common conception that it is men from the global south who are doing the smuggling and who are the evildoers. And that is a continual kind of idea. So it's both a sort of racialized and gendered kind of construction of the smuggler. And we have the same thing with the traffickers as well. In trafficking, what we are seeing globally is that even though women from the global south, or brown and black women, are predominantly classified as the ones being trafficked, they are also the ones who are being given the least assistance and ability to stay in a country or being offered protections if they are seen to be trafficked and often deported home. So there's a disproportionate focus on black, brown and black, poor brown and black women moving around the world, but they're not necessarily given the support or the rights that they should have.
What do you think is the biggest myth about human smuggling versus human trafficking?
I would think, as Professor Kempadoo said at the beginning, it's this notion that migrants, or that everybody who travels with traffickers and with the so-called traffickers and smugglers, right? Because this is also a legal construct, that everybody who travels with them are victims, that they don't know better, that these are things that are being imposed onto them by other evil people who happen to look just like them. So I think that by bringing race, class, and gender into the equation, the work of multiple scholars shows that these narratives simply facilitate the criminalization primarily of black and brown people, around the world, and on their justification that they are being evil to their own kind. And this eliminates, right, or reduces the need to take a closer look at how governments, at how states are the ones that are creating the barriers and the mechanisms that prevent people from moving equally, freely, and in a dignifying way. So it's very important to bring this intersectionality informed perspectives into the equation, because otherwise we lose all of this nuance that is being used to perpetuate this specific myth.
There's one example that came up recently around this idea of trafficking. It's a very interesting case. Last year and earlier this year, a senator in the United States decided and called for the criminalization of the Cuban government and labeled them as traffickers because they were Cuba was sending medical brigades around, particularly the Caribbean region and Latin America perhaps, to assist with the COVID pandemic, right? And these medical brigades have a long history from Cuba, but they were really important for many countries in the region. And I happened to be in Barbados when those teams arrived, and they were, they propped up, and they're still there, they're working for the people. But the Cuban government got condemned as trafficking its doctors and nurses, and called for also the labeling and the identification of those governments that received these medical brigades, such as the Barbadian government. And this caused an immense uproar in the smaller country because they needed the aid. They did not want to be seen as, aiding and abetting in trafficking. And, it sort of gets out of hand. I mean, this idea of trafficking is being used willy-nilly, to demonize not just brown and black, men and women in the global south, but also governments that are not favorable to the West, or the global north does not, view favorably. And it's used in a political way.
Are there any trends that you've noticed that leave you hopeful or inspired for the future? Gabriella, would you like to start?
For the last 5 years, I have been collaborating with an organization here in the U.S.-Mexico border. It's called DIA. And DIA is the only organization, or the only nonprofit in Mexico that is working with children who are identified as facilitating border crossings. And we do this not by doing this, what would be the more traditional intervention of rescue, right, that typically people are used to when we speak about trafficking and smuggling, but rather creating mechanisms for the children, for the teenagers themselves to do their research, for them becoming their researchers, and for them disseminating the knowledge and the content concerning their activities. By removing, right, the adult voices, or what have been the more dominant academic voices, and by allowing this group of young people to communicate and to publish and to decide what they want to say about their experiences facilitating border crossings, we are also trying to create, new ways and new narratives, new understandings of how smuggling or this facilitation again of border crossings takes place. Also, over the years, I have been very encouraged to see the work of more and more researchers from the Global South, many of them migrants themselves, who, having experienced smuggling or trafficking, have also decided to engage in these counter narratives. And how by coming together, they have also been able to create new spaces, create paths that have allowed for the inclusion of their work in the discussions at the international level. We are very happy that we have been part of those conversations, and that now we see a more critical understanding, for example, of what the traditional way to envision human smuggling is. If when the protocol first was developed, there was this very strict identification or connection to organized crime. Now, if you look at the most recent report of migrant smuggling, that was put out by the UNODC, you will see that there is a recognition that migrant smuggling is in fact facilitated by multiple forms of organizations, many of them people, acting on their own. So once you also see the inclusion of that work of people from the Global South who are able to be part of these debates, is also, from my perspective, very encouraging.
I work with an organization in Toronto that is a Asian migrant sex worker, massage parlor worker organization. So the organization is Butterfly. They are doing some amazing work with the workers in contesting attempts to rescue them from this work. They're pushing back against it. They're demanding that local governments legalize or decriminalize the massage parlor and sex work industry. And they're, mobilizing and talking to the workers and really putting out a different narrative. And it's exciting to see that. It's hopeful. It's a way that I think will change some of the narrative around human smuggling and human trafficking. And to me, that's a really important and exciting development.
Thanks to Professor Kempadoo and Gabriella Sanchez for joining me today. And thank you for listening. This is a CERC Migration and Democracy podcast, produced in collaboration with Lead Podcasting. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe to Borders and Belonging on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on human smuggling, human trafficking, and the organizations mentioned by our guests, please visit the show notes. I'm Maggie Perzyna. Thanks for listening.